Hi, well this is our last clue, and I sure hope you had a lot of fun figuring out how you were going to put your particular units together. We showed you 18 different possibilities, and by now I'm hoping or assuming that you have your hexagon put together. And we have a little bit of a surprise for you here because we had to show you how to measure for the borders and how to finish the borders, and so I wanted to have two quilts to work with. So one of our staffers, Judy, did the mauve version of the quilt. So the first thing in order for you to do this time, in clue 2 we did these corner units. We didn't really tell you they were corner units, but we did one or two regular and two reverse. So you have a regular on one side and the reverse on the other, and then the same thing at the opposite end, and it makes this rectangle. You can see here digitally where those are, how they, the position of these corner triangles go into the quilt. And this is the main body of the quilt, and what we need to worry about next are the borders, how to measure for the borders, how to cut them, and how to sew them on. So this quilt has 3 different sections that make up the border, and you were asked at various clues in the past to reserve fabric for the borders. In clue 4 you were told to do the narrow stripe to reserve some pieces of this. You needed 2 pieces that are 56 inches long, and that's for the top and bottom of the quilt, and then you need 4 pieces that are 30 inches long, and 2 of those are for one side of the quilt and 2 of them are for the other side of the quilt. So that'll be border number 1. Border number 2 is this fabric that you were asked to reserve in clue 3. If you bought one of our kits, we give that strip to you in a long piece because we don't like to have seams if you don't need them in the middle of the quilt. So if you've bought your own yardage, you probably don't want to buy a 2-yard piece just to get 3 or 4 2.5 or 2 1/4 inch strips from it. So then you'll have to put a seam in it. But that's border number 2. And border number 3 is the same border print, but it's the wide stripe, and that will go on number 3. It's best when you're dealing with border prints, I think, to do them individually so that you're going to be able to get the design exactly matching. So you will do this step, each step of the way, and it will tell you, you have pattern notes in the clue 8 that you download, and then I'm going to go through it with you as well. So the first thing we're going to do is to cut the piece for border number 1. Whenever you're measuring for a quilt, this is extremely important. You want to measure not across the edge when you're going to do a border. You don't measure the length of the border by going across the edge of the quilt. You measure by going across the middle of the quilt. The reason for that is because of bias edges, seams, other things along the edge of the quilt. You're almost always going to get a wider measurement across the bottom than you are across the middle. So what you have to do is cut it to fit these pieces, because that's where everything is in place, the correct measurement, and then you have to ease the pieces in, and we'll talk about that when we get to the sewing part later. So by measuring across the center of the quilt, here's my long 56-inch strip. I'm going to find approximately halfway of this strip to find sort of more or less the middle, and then I'm going to find right at that middle area one of these mirror image portions of the design, and I'm going to put it across right smack in the middle of the quilt where all those points come together, and then just gently lay it out the edge. Don't stretch it because we just want it to fit the quilt just so. You're going to find a little extra at either end, but that's to allow for the miter. And in case you wanted a different mirror image in the center, you can either go with that mirror image in the center or this one. So you shift it one way or the other. We just wanted you to have plenty. So you just gently lay that across the center of your quilt. You find either a table big enough or get on the floor and on a carpet and spread it out. Then this is where I like my 45-degree ruler. It has the perfect cut for an angle for the quilt, and I want you to watch carefully what I do here. We're going to line this ruler up. This is the place where the border print meets the edge of the quilt. So what you're going to be doing is lining this up, and then I'm going to move this ruler over till the angle, the 45-degree angle of the ruler, fits right at that little corner there. You can watch me go. You can say stop out loud when I'm ready to stop. Okay, stop. Now because this is the seam allowance already included, So I get that lined up exactly, just maybe a hair longer, and then I'm going to take my tailor's chalk and just draw that little miter line. Now, I find it just as easy then to pick this up, not the whole strip, but just this little edge of the strip, and use my scissors to cut that angle. You can rotary cut it if you want, but then you got to get out your mat and your rotary cutter and all that stuff. So this makes it just kind of quick. So that's my first miter. Now, why did we put the center of the quilt right at a mirror image portion of the border print? That's so that we'll have the same identical motif at either end. So then I will pick this edge up. I'm going to move this over so you can see very gently. I'm not picking up the whole strip. I'm leaving this in place where I patted it down nicely. Very gently just move this over to this edge. Now, I'm not going to move exactly to the edge because what's the most important thing is to match the design of the border print. So it might be off by a slight hair, but I want to make sure that that design is exactly matched. And then instead of marking it, I can just take my scissors and cut that strip. Okay, so there's my first strip. Right there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is take the second strip. You know, we had you cut two 56-inch pieces, so I'm going to find the second strip, and I'm going to lay it on top of this. And I'm going to find the exact same spot with the design on here, the exact spot. I'm just going to gently lay this down here. And it exactly matches up down here, so I can just pick this up very carefully, make sure that's in place. And I'm just going to cut that off. So now what I have are the two pieces, one for the top and one for the bottom of the quilt. Now, the quilt is not square. If it was a square piece, I could continue the same process and cut two more exactly the same, and it would fit on the square quilt. Now, why you want those exactly the same is that we want this design to go nicely around the corner. We have to match these exactly as they go around the corner. So that's our top and bottom, but because it's rectangular, we can't be sure that if we just cut a rectangular piece to fit that it's going to come out at the same place on the bottom. So remember, we had you cut 4 pieces for the next sides of the quilt. These 4 pieces, we told you to cut 30 inches long. So why do we have 4 pieces? Because as you look at this quilt, we got the center. We want the corner piece to exactly match those that we just cut. So, you know, we need that to exactly match. But if I go down to the other end, it's not going to match down here. So I go to the center and I make a cut, and I have 2 pieces that are mirror image of each other. Now I'm going to do that physically so you can see. It's all in the pattern, downloaded instructions, but it's also here. So let me show you first. The first thing we want to do is take one of these pieces, which is our top, let's call it our top piece, and one of these pieces that was designated to cut 30 inches for the side. Now here again, I'm going to put this design exactly on top, and I'm going to cut the miter because remember, we want those corners to be exactly the same. So this will represent one corner of the quilt, and I'm going to cut that off. All right, so now I've got my little 30-inch piece. I'm going to set my regular piece aside. I'm going to go to the side of the quilt. So this is the short side, this is the long side. I've already cut this miter. So we've got the miter all nicely cut, and we know it's going to match the other ones at the corner. And I'm going to put the edge of this piece right down there. I'm going to come to the center of the quilt. So now I've got this laid across the center of the quilt, matching this angle of the miter right at the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to come to the center. So my ruler right here is representing the center of the quilt right at the dot. So I don't want to be at the center. I want to be a 1/4 inch beyond the center, because if I cut it right off at the center, I'm going to have short pieces when I sew them together. So I'm going to go that 1/4 inch beyond the center, and I'm going to use my tailor's chalk to mark it. Now that is marked 1/4 inch beyond the center of the quilt. So that's one of the pieces for the side edge of the quilt. Now, we need another piece that's the mirror image of that to go to the other side. So I need 2 pieces like this, and I need 2 pieces that are the reverse of this. So let me go ahead and cut the other exact piece. I'm going to line this up exactly on top of the design so that border matches at the miter. And I'm going to cut it like this. And remember, we cut this 1/4 inch beyond the center, and I'm going to cut that off right there. The next thing I'm going to do is cut 2 more, but they have to be the reverse. And I'm going to turn it upside down on top of this. And I'm going to find the exact spot once again. And sometimes I find it easier if I fold this at a mirror image portion of the design and line it up to a mirror image portion of the design here, and then flop that over. And make sure this miter matches down at this end, which it does. And then here again, I'm going to cut this off. And I'm using that first piece that I cut as my pattern piece. And now this is the first reverse piece that I've cut. So I've got 2 that are cut one way. That's these 2. And 1 that's reverse. So now I'll just lay this on top of my last strip, exactly line up the design, and I'm going to make sure this matches exactly my pieces. And I'm going to cut that piece. So now you'll see what happens. Let me just take 1 regular and 1 reverse. And when I put those together, it's going to, of course there'll be a seam, so it'll be a little slightly different look, but it's going to be a mirror image here at the middle, and your eye never sees that at the center of the quilt. But what it would see is these edges when the miters come together if they didn't match. So you'll sew these together and the others together, put them on the quilt, and when you continue this with all 3 of the borders. Or you can at times, you might want to put this second piece, sew these together and put this second piece on there and make sure you leave enough to miter that. And you can just sew those 2 together and then put them on the quilt and then measure for the last one, the wider border when you get there. So one reason I had Judy bring her quilt in is so that you could see how I cut the borders. And now I want to show you also how you will sew them onto the quilt. So first of all, it's no different than sewing smaller pieces. You need to mark the dots, and those dots indicate the starting and stopping places, whether you're doing it by machine or by hand. And you need to pin very carefully. This is for marking these is where the perfect piecer comes in really handy. Because first of all, on the quilt itself, we need to mark that corner piece. And I want to mark the spot where that seam allowance would cross. So I use the square angle on the perfect piecer, just line it up, and then it has a dot right at the point of where those pieces are going to stop, and this is where your sewing is going to start and stop. Now why am I doing this? Why do we start and stop at the dots? Because this is like a set-in seam. You don't want to go all the way to the edge because you need to have that set-in seam when we get ready to sew the miter. So I've got the dots in the 2 spots. We also want to mark the dots on the border print. So and we're going to mark this one as well for later. This is a 45-degree angle that will be for when we actually sew the miters together. I'm going to mark that. And this is a 135-degree angle. That's a little hard to find on the perfect piecer, and I just want to explain to you how you do it. Across the piecer there's this miter line, and where it hits this inward angle here, it makes a turn. Well, going along the miter line and making the turn, that is the 135-degree angle. And there's a little hole right here. So let me put this miter line over here along the edge of the piece. You can see how it goes along the edge of the seam allowance. I've got it right there by the line and turns the corner, and this is the place where I want my dot to be. So come down to the other end, I have to turn the piecer upside down to get that miter line going at the edge of the fabric, and I make that turn and go ahead and mark the dot. So now that the dots are all marked, we're going to go in and we're going to pin this to the quilt, because I want to show you how you have to kind of ease some of the areas in if it seems like the quilt is too big for the border. But the border's correct because we measured across the middle. First thing I'm going to do is find the midway point of this border. This is the short side of the border. I'm going to find it's right here at that mirror image motif, and I'm going to put a pin right in the dot at the center of the quilt. Right here at the center. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it right at the center of the quilt. That point that comes right together there. I'm going to put that right at the center. Then I'm going to come down to this end, and I'm going to put a pin right through that dot and through the dot on the other side. It's kind of showing through so I can see it here. I'm going to put these edges together, put the pin straight up and down so I know they're lined up. You'll see that little bit of white of the corner of the right angle coming through, and take the pin out now and come up right at the dot, because that's where I'm going to start sewing. I like to make a habit of when I pin in and have it come out at the spots where I'm going to either start or stop. Now as I go to the center, this fits pretty well, so I don't have that much to ease. We'll probably have more to ease on the sides than we do here. So I'm just going to take sort of the halfway point there and then just put several pins in here all along the edge. And I would keep doing more, but it looks like we don't really have much to ease in over here. If you have to ease in a little bit extra, you put many, many pins in there and ease out the fullness. I come down here to the next corner, do the same thing. I'm going to find the dot, find the next dot, make sure they're all lined up. We see that little tiny corner of the right angle showing through, and put this in here. And then we'll pin that the same way. Now there's a little bit of fullness, it's probably from the bias of this that we have to ease in, and since this light colored triangle is on the straight of the grain, I'm going to not try to ease anything there, but try to get that easing in here with that little bit of extra fullness from this bias piece. So I can just kind of feel it fall into place there, put a pin in the middle. I'll put another pin sort of in the middle there. So that tiny little bit of extra fullness that was in there, I can just ease that in when I'm sewing. So then you just sew the strips on one at a time, and you leave that opening. Make sure you stop at the dot at both ends, and I'll show you why in a minute. So I've got my quilt here now. I've left one of these corners. I've gone ahead and sewn the miters. I've left one undone. You'll see I stopped at the corner. I didn't sew to the edge because you need that extra. And so I wanted to show you about sewing the miter. Now, even if you have been sewing this whole thing on the sewing machine, I just really feel when you're sewing the border prints together and matching the designs that It's a lot easier to do by hand. Even if you pin it carefully and sew it on the machine, sometimes the machine scooches the top part a little bit and it messes up the way the design lays out. So I just find it a lot easier to do it by hand, even if a lot of the other part has been done by machine. So now we're ready to sew up this miter, and this is that little bit of a set-in seam down here where they join the edge of the quilt. And the most important thing here is to get it pinned properly. We cut the miters to try to match that design as much as we possibly could. So now we want to take advantage of that. So we're going to pin it so we can match up the designs on the border print exactly. So here we have the corner of the quilt where those two pieces came right together. I'm going to pull the edges together, but before I put any pin in here, I'm going to match. See those little white designs there? I'm going to just come in and get them exactly lined up, and then I'm going to stick a pin in there. Then I'm going to come down here. Of course, I need to line up the seam and these lines from the border print. So those dark lines and the pattern are coming exactly. And I'm going to put another pin right there and hold it, to hold it in place. Then this piece, I don't have to match the blue. I don't have to match any design, but I do down here have to match the border again. To find, so this one I have to pull a little bit this way to match that design and the stripe. So you have to just take some time to line this up. You just can't slap the edges together and expect to have a beautiful match of the corners, but it really makes a difference in your overall quilt. So it's the cutting carefully, the pinning carefully, and then just sewing where you've pinned it. So now I'm going to come down here, I'm going to match this little piece here. You can see it takes a while. You can't expect just to put the pieces together and pin it and start sewing. And then at last down here, make sure these lines are, so I want to show you in a second, as soon as I get this last pin in here, how if you look on this side of it, you don't necessarily always have all the raw edges lined up, or the cut edges, because we're trying to do the design. And this will all make up in the wash, and then I have a little trick at the end to show you as well. So there's really no secret to how we sew this. If you want to mark your sewing line, you lay your ruler down along there, mark your sewing line. So I'm not going to take your time to sew up this miter. I've already sewn the other three miters together, so I can show you how one of those edges looks when it's all cut. I've not yet pressed it. So here you can see how the design comes together. And that's what you want all the way up, to have those designs match at the miter, and that's how you get it. And I also want to show you here, remember how for those longer sides, because the quilt is not square, remember how we had to put a seam in those border prints? Well, you can see here where the seam is. But because there's the mirror image, this one is almost identical to the actual motif, so it's very close. This one is quite a ways away, but because it's a mirror image motif, your eye never sees that. I mean, it just shows a pretty design. So I'm going to take just a second and set up the iron and show you my little trick on those miters on the corner in case they're not quite exactly the way they should be. So I'll be back in a second. So now that that miter is sewn, you want to set the seam. So I always go back here and take the iron and just set that seam a little bit. Here again, I love my woolly ironing mat for this. Just squaring that off. Now I think what you're going to notice is, first of all, I'm going to bring that seam on the back to one side. So it's all coming this way. And I've got it straight at a nice right angle here, and I've got it at a nice right angle here. And if you look, looks like there's a little excess in here. That's okay, that happens. So what I'm going to do is take my iron and it just irons that crease in there and makes that corner nice and sharp, a nice, really nice right angle. And you'll notice here, if I pull this apart, there's a little bit of a crease in there. So what I will do is I'll go back over to this side and I will sew along, pick up where the crease starts and sew right along the crease. And that gives me a nice sharp point. This usually happens with almost any mitered corner that you could do, whether you're doing a border print or not. Once you get the one corner done, you'll do exactly the same thing on all four, just to even them out. So once your quilt top is finished, the all-important question is, how am I going to quilt it? And we get that question asked all the time. Now, in this day where so many people are doing their quilting by machine or sending it to a long armor, I don't have any expertise in that field. I do hand piecing and hand quilting, and I would leave it to your long arm person. But I will say some of my thoughts. You know, when you put a lot of effort into a quilt like this that has a lot of design elements, to me, the quilting should enhance the design of the quilt top, not be a completely separate design on its own merit. Sometimes I see these quilts that are just all over quilted, like a zigzag or puzzle type pattern, and they really, it's kind of like taking a pretty painting and scribbling on top of it, to my mind. So I think you want to find, if you're sending it out to be quilted, someone who will work with you to follow some of the pattern that's on there, or enhance some of the plainer areas. You might have something interesting in the corner pieces, because that's a pretty large area that you could put some sort of decorative design. But for me, for quilting it, when there's so much border print involved, I like to follow the design on the border print. So for instance, in this center hexagon, you have these little lines going around. You get these kaleidoscopic effects. Now normally I do not like to quilt on top of seams. I try to avoid the seams because that's just extra thickness that you have to quilt through. But when I'm doing something like this hexagon that's in the middle, I like, instead of enhancing the individual triangles, I don't want people to see those individual 6 triangles. I want them to see that little kaleidoscopic design as a whole. So I would probably quilt around these little circular things, both outside and inside, which means I'm going to be on the seams in a couple of places, but I just live with that. This little rope thing that's going around the edge, I would probably quilt. So I would probably go on the inside, I would quilt around that, come here and go around the outside of that, go there. So, you know, as little or as much quilting as you like, but I'm always an advocate for more is better. On the lines, on these lines, I would just quilt right along the line, because there's no seam underneath those except when you get to the joinings of the edge of the triangle. So I always like to look on the border print and see someplace that I could actually quilt around part of the design, and I do that throughout on all these pieces. These points here, what a pretty curly design this is here. You could just do your quilting around the edge of that, find some other motif to quilt around. Now what about the foundation piecing? There's a lot of seams in there. I've done this type of a twisted shape before. I did a pentagon, and I've done squares and so forth, and I tend to want to just quilt a line right up the middle of the piece. Most of them are too small to do 2 lines. Maybe when we get out to these, then I would do a line on either side, about 1/4 inch in from the edge on those, like that. And here again, rather than emphasizing the individual shape, I would probably take my line and come all the way and quilt on top of that seam and then down the next side. I like to have my quilting a little more than 1/4 inch, so I go just beyond the 1/4 inch with my hand quilting. Otherwise I'm quilting on top of different layers, which is not fun. So that's more or less how I would go. These star points here, I would probably quilt around the point 1/4 inch in from the edge, and if it was still a little puffy in the middle, I'd probably take a piece of masking tape and put it in there, either 1/4 inch masking tape or 1/2 inch, and then just quilt another little triangle in there as well to just fill out the quilting. A lot of different ways to look at it. I really, truly hope you've enjoyed this quilt. We're going to show you some images of the colorways of the different colors. I hope you've enhanced your sewing skills, and we'll be ready to do another one next year. we really want you to send photos when it's finished. And we'd like to see what you've done, particularly this year, since we have so many different variations that could be done. We'd like to see some of those variations, and we'll post them on my blog and on Facebook. And so thanks for participating, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed teaching you.